The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, while Wade Calloway was eating a gas station sandwich in the cab of his truck and watching rain move sideways across the Tillamook County Fairgrounds parking lot. He had been sleeping in that lot for 11 days. Not because he had no options. He had options. The VA had given him a pamphlet with a list of shelters in Portland, which was 2.5 hours south, and his cousin Dennis had a couch in Beaverton that had been offered twice with the specific tone of someone hoping the offer would not be accepted. Wade had not accepted it. He had been sleeping in parking lots and rest stops along Highway 6 since August, when the settlement from the labor dispute had come through. $14,000, which his lawyer had called a victory, and which Wade had calculated would cover 8 months of expenses if he was careful, 7 if he wasn't, and which represented, in any case, considerably less than the cost of the knee surgery that the injury had required and the workers' comp had denied. The knee was fine. That was what he told people. What he meant was that it worked, which was not the same thing, but was enough. Maverick was asleep on the passenger seat, his chin on the center console, his breathing slow and audible over the rain on the roof. 8 years old now, which was old for a working dog but not old for Maverick, who had the specific constitution of an animal that had decided to ignore the actuarial tables. He had been assigned to Wade's unit in 2017 after 3 deployments with a different handler, and when Wade separated from the Army in 2019, the paperwork to adopt him had taken 4 months and cost $1,200 and had been the least complicated decision Wade had made in his adult life. The phone showed a Portland area code he didn't recognize. "Mr. Calloway, this is Patricia Hess calling from Hess and Dunmore Estate Law." A pause. "I'm sorry to inform you that your grandfather, Edgar Allen Calloway, passed away on November 4th. He was 91 years old." Wade looked at the rain on the windshield. He had met Edgar Calloway 4 times. The last time was at a family reunion in 2003, when Wade was 21 and Edgar was 70. And what he remembered was a thin man with careful eyes, who had sat at the far end of the picnic table and listened more than he spoke, and left early without explaining why. His aunt had said afterward, in the particular murmur people used for things they had decided not to discuss directly, that Edgar was difficult. His Uncle Roy had been less diplomatic. He made his choices a long time ago, and he has to live with them. Or not live with them, as the case may be. Wade had never learned what choices those were. He had not thought to ask. And then he had gone to Fort Benning, and then to Afghanistan, and then to other places. And Edgar had not come up again. "There is one asset in the estate," Patricia Hess continued. "A property in Tillamook County, one covered bridge and an adjacent caretaker's cottage located on Calloway Creek Road. Mr. Calloway has named you as the sole beneficiary." "Why me?" A short pause. Lawyers' pauses, Wade had learned, were not the same as regular pauses. They meant something had been considered, and a version had been chosen. He didn't say in so many words, "His accompanying letter to you is sealed. You'll receive it with the property documents. I can tell you that the county has appraised the property at $1, given its structural designation. $1. The bridge has been flagged as a deteriorating structure by Tillamook County Public Works. The cottage hasn't had an occupant since 1987. The county's position is that the property has no viable commercial value in its current state." Another pause. "I want to be transparent with you, Mr. Calloway. There is also a pending infrastructure project that affects the parcel. A representative from the county commissioner's office may contact you regarding acquisition." Wade looked at Maverick. Maverick opened one eye. "What's the address?" Wade said. Calloway Creek Road was 12 miles east of Tillamook proper, up into the Coast Range where the Douglas fir grew close to the shoulders and the light came down filtered and gray even on clear days. In November, it was the specific gray of a sky that had forgotten it was capable of anything else. Wade drove slowly, the truck's heater working against a cold that had moved in off the Pacific the week before and shown no indication of leaving. He almost missed the turnoff. There was no sign, just a gap in the tree line and a gravel track that had been gravel once and was now mostly a suggestion of gravel. 2 shallow ruts through the ferns with a strip of moss down the center that the truck's undercarriage brushed against as he eased down toward the sound of water. He heard the bridge before he saw it. Not the bridge itself, the creek beneath it, running fast with November rain, audible through the closed windows as a low, continuous sound that the truck's engine almost but not quite covered. Then the trees opened, and he stopped. The bridge was roughly 60 feet long, single lane, with a peaked wooden roof and lattice sides, the kind of covered bridge that existed in the Willamette Valley and the Coast Range in numbers that surprised people who thought of them as a New England phenomenon. This one had been painted barn red at some point in the past, and the red had faded to a color closer to rust, and the rust had faded to the color of old wood, which was what it was mostly becoming. One of the side panels on the downstream face had partially separated at the top and leaned outward at a degree that was not structurally catastrophic, but was the kind of thing that became structurally catastrophic if left alone. The cottage sat on the near bank, set back from the road in a stand of red alder. 2 rooms, a covered porch, a stone chimney. The roof was intact, which was the first thing Wade checked, the specific habit of a man who had spent years assessing structures for their most fundamental capability. The porch sagged at the near corner. The windows were intact, but filmed with 60 years of accumulated grime that made them opaque rather than transparent, so that the cottage seemed to have its eyes closed. He got out. Maverick dropped from the passenger seat to the gravel and moved immediately to the edge of the porch without being directed, nose working along the foundation line. Wade stood and looked at the bridge. He thought about what a man left behind and what it meant and why it went to a grandchild he had spoken to 4 times. Then he went up the porch steps. The second one bowed, but held, and tried the key Patricia Hess had mailed him. It turned on the first attempt. The door opened inward on hinges that protested briefly and then accepted the situation. The smell came first, closed air, damp wood, the cold specific odor of a space that had been sealed long enough to develop its own climate. Underneath that, fainter, something papery and dry, the smell of documents. Wade went in first. Maverick followed a moment later, moving to the center of the single main room and beginning a slow, methodical circuit of the walls. Nose low, not anxious. Reading the space the way he read every new space. Cataloging, storing, establishing what was there. His nails on the old plank floor were the only sound. The room held a table, 2 ladder-back chairs, a wood stove, and a shelf of books whose spines had faded to indistinction. On the wall above the table hung a map, not a road map, but a survey map, the kind that showed property boundaries and waterways and elevation contours. Large format, pinned at the 4 corners. Hand annotated in red ink, dense and precise, covering what appeared to be most of Tillamook County. Wade stood in front of it for a long time. The annotations were in a small, careful handwriting, dates, initials, acreage figures, notations he couldn't parse without context. Whatever Edgar Calloway had been doing in this cottage alone, he had been doing it carefully, and he had considered it important enough to leave on the wall for 37 years. He was still reading when he heard the vehicle on the gravel road outside. The man who knocked was perhaps 55, built like someone who had been athletic once and had softened into a kind of permanent assurance. He wore a vest over a flannel shirt, the specific combination of someone who wanted to appear practical while also appearing professional. And he smiled with the complete comfort of a person who expected smiling to work. Mr. Calloway. His handshake was firm, calibrated. Wes Drummond. I'm the District 3 Commissioner for Tillamook County. I heard from Patricia Hess's office that you'd be coming out. He looked past Wade at the cottage interior with the expression of a man appraising something he had already decided the value of. Beautiful old property, real history here. Maverick had stopped his circuit of the room. He stood between Wade and the door. not blocking it, not growling, not performing any of the threat displays he was capable of and rarely used. Just standing. Both ears pressed flat and still in the register Wade recognized as the one that came after assessment and before conclusion. "I'll be honest with you," Drummond said. "The county has a water management project in development. Habitat restoration, expanded riparian buffer zones, good environmental work. This bridge sits at a critical point in the watershed." He reached into his vest pocket and produced an envelope, held it out with the ease of someone accustomed to this part of a conversation. "We'd like to make this straightforward. $28,000, clean title transfer, and the county assumes all liability for the structure. You walk away today." Wade looked at the envelope. $28,000 was more money than he had in the world by a significant margin. He was aware of this the way you were aware of cold, as information about conditions, not as instruction about what to do with them. He looked at Maverick. Maverick was still watching Drummond. Not the envelope, not the door. Drummond's face, with the level, unblinking attention of an animal that had cataloged something and was waiting to see if its assessment required revision. It did not appear to require revision. "I just got here," Wade said. Drummond kept the smile. "Of course. Take your time." He set the envelope on the table beside the survey map, which he did not look at, which was itself a kind of information. "I'll leave that with you. My number's inside." He left. His vehicle, a county-branded pickup, clean, turned on the gravel and went back up the road without hurrying. Wade picked up the envelope and put it in his jacket pocket without opening it. Then he looked at the survey map again. Then at Maverick, who had returned to his circuit of the room and was now standing at the entrance to the back room, looking at the floor. Not at Wade. At the floor. "Okay," Wade said. He didn't know yet what he was agreeing to. He spent the first afternoon on the bridge, not repairing it, he didn't have materials, but reading it, the way a man who had spent 20 years working with his hands learned to read structures. You started at the foundation and worked up. You looked at what held and what didn't, and you looked at the pattern of what didn't, because the pattern told you whether you were dealing with age or neglect or something more specific. The bridge's foundation timbers were Douglas fir, old growth, the kind cut before 1940 that didn't exist anymore in dimensions like that. They had checked meaning the surface had begun to crack along the grain, but checking was not rot, and when Wade pressed his thumb into the wood, the resistance was still there. Solid. Someone had treated these timbers repeatedly over decades. The evidence was in the layering, old preservative soaked into the grain, then newer preservative over that, then newer still, the most recent application perhaps 10 years ago. Someone had been maintaining this bridge long after they had stopped maintaining anything else. He checked every bearing point. He walked the deck planking and noted which boards had been replaced and which were original and how recently the replacements had been made. He looked at the latticed siding, at the roof purlins, at the iron hardware connecting the trusses, all of it showing the same pattern. Deliberate, ongoing, careful maintenance applied by someone who understood what they were doing and intended the structure to last. This was not the bridge of a man who had given up. He was back in the cottage by dark, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, because the chairs looked uncertain, eating crackers from a sleeve he'd bought at the gas station and reading the survey map by flashlight. Maverick lay 3 feet away, chin on his paws, watching Wade with the patient attention of an animal that had decided the most useful thing it could do at this moment was observe. The map was dated 1958 in the lower right corner, with subsequent annotations added in what appeared to be different years. The ink color shifted subtly as you moved through the decades, black to blue to black, again as pens ran out and were replaced. The base layer showed Tillamook County's waterways, roads, and property boundaries as they had existed in 1958. Over that base layer, Edgar had built something else entirely. Red lines traced property boundaries, not the original ones, but transfers, sales, each one notated with a date, a dollar amount per acre, and 2 sets of initials, the seller and the buyer. The buyer's initials were almost always the same 3 letters, appearing again and again across the face of the map in Edgar's small red handwriting. TVI. Tillamook Valley Irrigation. Wade knew the name. Everyone in the county knew it. It was on the signs at the edge of the managed farmland, on the trucks that serviced the drainage ditches, on the letterhead of various county water board documents that had been in the news periodically over the years. It was the kind of institutional name that had been present long enough to feel like geography rather than company. He counted the transfer notations on the map. He lost count at 90 and started again. There were more than 200. He was still reading when the truck went past on the county road above, a diesel engine, running fast, backfire on the downshift as it took the curve. The sound hit him before he could process it as sound. He was on the floor. He did not remember moving. His back was against the base of the wood stove, knees pulled up, hands flat on the floorboards on either side of his thighs. The flashlight had rolled somewhere to his left. The room was very dark. Not Oregon, not November. Kandahar Province, July 2008. The road between Arghandab and the fire base, a route they had cleared twice that week and were clearing a third time because cleared meant something different in that particular valley than it meant anywhere else. Wade's team in a 4-vehicle column, Wade in the 3rd truck, the lead vehicle at a curve between 2 compound walls. The flash had come from the left, low, close, the specific geometry of a pressure plate at road level. He had keyed the radio before the sound reached him. Left side, stop, stop, stop. And the column had stopped, and the men in the lead vehicle had gotten out, and 2 of them had walked away from it, and 1 of them had not. He had given the right order. That was what the after-action report said. The right order at the right time, and the outcome had been what it was because of geometry and timing and physics that no order could have changed. He knew this. He had known it for 16 years. Knowing it and sleeping through the night were 2 different things. Then Maverick was there. He came without urgency, no scrambling, no whining, no performance of concern. He simply crossed the dark room and pressed his full weight into Wade's chest. 94 pounds of German Shepherd settling against him with the deliberate commitment of an animal that understood exactly what it was doing and had been doing it for years. His chin came up onto Wade's left shoulder. His breathing was 6 inches from Wade's left ear, slow and absolutely even. Wade's hands found the dog's sides. He held on. The breathing was real. The weight was real. The cold plank floor under his palms was real. And the sound of the creek outside was real. Continuous, unhurried, indifferent to 2008 in the specific way that moving water was indifferent to everything that happened beside it. Oregon, November. A cottage that smelled of old paper and someone else's careful decades. He sat there until his own breathing matched Maverick's. Then he found the flashlight and went back to the map. In the morning, he drove to the Tillamook Library and asked for the county property records from 1950 to 1970. The librarian, a woman in her 60s, who looked at Maverick with the expression of someone deciding whether the rule about animals applied in this specific case, brought him 3 bound volumes and left him at a table near the window without asking questions. He spent 4 hours cross-referencing. Every transfer notation on Edgar's map corresponded to a real transaction in the county records. Name, date, acreage, dollar amount. Edgar had been accurate on every point he could verify. The sellers were listed by full name in the records, families, most of them, with Tillamook County addresses, and in the column marked Reason for Sale, various designations. Voluntary sale, voluntary sale. Economic hardship sale, voluntary sale. Wade wrote down names in a notebook he bought from the library's small supply rack. He wrote down 40 names before he stopped, not because he had run out, but because 40 was enough to see the shape of the thing. The sales clustered in a specific period, 1952 to 1967, and in a specific geography, the drainage basin of Tillamook Creek and its tributaries, the exact watershed that the bridge sat at the center of. And the acreage prices were low, not market low, systematically, uniformly, inexplicably low, as if every seller in that basin for 15 years had arrived at the same undervalued assessment of their own land, or as if someone had given them a reason to believe the land wasn't worth more. He drove back to the cottage. He sat at the table and read the county tax assessor's notes he'd photographed with his phone, and he read them against the survey map, and the picture that assembled itself was the kind of picture that had a word for it in the law, and a different, shorter word for it in plain language. He was looking at that picture when Maverick left his place by the wood stove and walked to the back room. Same as yesterday. He went to the same spot in the floor, center of the back wall, 6 feet from the corner, and began the same figure-8 pattern, methodical, precise. Then he sat, both eyes on Wade, ears forward, not moving. Wade got the tire iron from the truck. The floorboard came up in sections. Someone had cut the plank along the grain precisely, with a saw fine enough that the cut line was barely visible unless you were looking for it. And Wade had not been looking for it, which was the point. The cavity beneath was not large, roughly the size of a suitcase, cut from the original foundation earth and lined with a single course of flat stones set without mortar, the way old root cellars were built, the way men built things when they intended them to outlast their own supervision. Inside the cavity, a metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas and sealed at every seam with roofing compound that had been applied carefully and had held for... Wade checked the ceiling for a moment, doing arithmetic. At least 37 years if Edgar had placed it here when he left in 1987. Possibly longer. The compound was intact. No moisture had gotten in. He lifted it out, heavier than it looked. He carried it to the table and set it under the window, where the morning light came in gray and flat off the creek. Maverick followed and lay down 3 feet away, chin on his paws, watching with the focused patience of an animal that understood something was about to happen and had decided the appropriate role was witness. The roofing compound peeled away in strips. Beneath it, 4 small bolts, rusted but workable. He used the flathead from his truck toolkit and took his time. The lid came off cleanly. Inside, packed in a 3rd layer of waxed canvas, neatly folded, a composition notebook, the standard black and white kind, 100 pages, the sort sold in every drugstore in America since before Wade was born. Beneath the notebook, a large manila envelope sealed with wax, the old-fashioned kind pressed with a flat object rather than a stamp. And beneath the envelope, wrapped separately in a square of oilcloth, a photograph, black and white, printed on heavy paper stock, 6 inches by 4 inches, its edges still sharp. Wade set the photograph on the table face down. He would get to it. He picked up the notebook first. It was not a diary. He understood this within the first page. Edgar Calloway had not written about himself, not his thoughts, not his days, not his feelings about what he was doing or why. He had written about land, specifically other people's land, and what had happened to it. The notebook was a registry, handwritten, organized by family name, covering... Wade counted the entries in the first 5 pages and calculated forward. Approximately 230 families, each entry running between half a page and 2 pages, depending on what Edgar had been able to document. The format was consistent throughout: family name, acreage, location by section, and township, year of acquisition, year of sale, sale price per acre, buyer, and then a column Edgar had labeled simply circumstance. It was the circumstance column that took Wade's breath away. He read the first entry in full. Tidewater, Henry J. and Ruth M., 340 acres, Section 12, Township 2S. Purchased 1931. Family homestead. Sale to TVI. March 1954, $4.20 acre. Circumstance, County Assessor Report, October 1953, land reclassified agriculturally marginal due to insufficient precipitation data, 1950 to 1953. Reclassification enabled TVI purchase option at distressed rate. Note, precipitation data for this period sourced exclusively from TVI's own weather station at Headquarters Road. State Weather Service data for same period shows normal rainfall. I have compared both data sets. They do not agree. Wade read it twice. He turned the page. The second entry named a different family. Same structure, same precision. A different year, a different acreage, the same buyer, the same mechanism. A county reclassification based on rainfall data supplied by the company that subsequently purchased the land at distressed prices, compared in Edgar's careful notation against state meteorological records that told a different story. The third entry, the fourth, the fifth, he read for an hour without stopping. 230 families, 15 years, one company. The same manufactured mechanism, applied again and again with the patience and confidence of people who believed they were operating in a space no one was watching, who believed the data they controlled was the only data that would ever be consulted, that the families selling their land would not think to compare rainfall figures, that the county assessors processing the reclassifications were either complicit or simply uninterested in looking behind the numbers they were handed. Edgar Calloway had looked behind the numbers. He had done it alone, over years, in a cottage at the end of a gravel road, with the methodical precision of a man who had decided that accuracy was the only tool available to him, and had therefore become very accurate. He had sourced the state meteorological records himself. He had obtained the TVI weather station data, Wade could not yet tell how, and had compared them, entry by entry, family by family, year by year. He had done it without a computer, without a database, without anything except paper and time and the specific stubbornness of a man who had understood what was happening and could not make himself stop understanding it. They called him difficult, Wade thought. They said he made his choices. He set the notebook down and picked up the manila envelope. The wax seal was intact. He broke it carefully and drew out the contents. A sheaf of papers, 20 or 30 pages, photocopies of what appeared to be original documents. Purchase agreements with TVI's letterhead, county assessor reclassification notices, and, paper-clipped separately on letterhead he didn't immediately recognize, 2 pages of technical analysis comparing rainfall datasets, dense with figures, signed at the bottom by someone with a doctorate in hydrology from Oregon State University. Edgar had found an expert. He had gotten a scientist to look at the numbers and put their name on what the numbers showed. At the bottom of the envelope, folded separately, a single handwritten page. Not the registry's careful print. This was cursive, older and slightly less steady, the handwriting of someone writing with urgency or age or both. Wade unfolded it. To whoever opens this, it began. Not to a specific person, not to Wade, to whoever. I have spent 15 years attempting to bring this record to people with the authority to act on it. I appeared before the county commission in 1963. I was heard for 11 minutes and dismissed. I contacted the state land board in 1965 and received a form letter in return. I contacted 2 newspapers. One did not respond. One sent a reporter who came, took notes, and did not publish anything. I am not writing this to complain about those outcomes. I am writing it because I am 61 years old, and my health is not what it was, and I need to make sure this does not disappear when I do. I cannot return what was taken. I have understood for some time that I cannot. What I can do is make sure the record survives long enough to reach someone who can do something with it. I do not know who that person is. I am leaving this property to the person in my family I believe is most likely to open a box rather than sell it. The truth does not need a witness. It only needs to survive. E. A. Calloway, September 1987. Wade read the last line again. He set the letter down and picked up the photograph. 2 men standing in front of this bridge, the same bridge, younger, its red paint bright and new. One man was perhaps 35, lean, with the careful posture of someone who had recently been in the military and had not yet entirely released it. Wade recognized the eyes, even at 35. Edgar Calloway, before age had made him the man at the picnic table. The other man was perhaps 50, broader, with a face that carried the specific weathering of someone who had worked outdoors on the Oregon coast for most of his adult life. They were not smiling. They were not posing. They were simply standing together in front of the bridge, looking at the camera with the level, unperformed steadiness of two people who had understood each other for long enough that being photographed together required no explanation. On the back, in Edgar's handwriting, Henry Tidewater. April 1958. The first one who trusted me. Wade set the photograph down carefully on the table. Outside, the creek ran on. Maverick had not moved from his position 3 feet away, chin on paws, watching, the long patience of an animal that understood that some moments required a human to sit still and let the weight of a thing settle before deciding what to do with it. Wade sat still. He let the weight settle. Then he picked up the notebook again and turned to the first entry. Tidewater, Henry J., and Ruth M. He read it again, more slowly this time, the way you read something when you have decided it deserves that. The legal notice arrived on a Thursday, folded inside a county envelope with a return address from the Department of Public Works. Wade read it standing on the porch, Maverick sitting beside his left boot. Notice of Structural Hazard Designation. Tillamook County Covered Bridge, Calloway Creek Road. The language was bureaucratic and thorough and ultimately simple. The structure had been assessed as presenting an active public safety risk, and the owner of record was required to either demonstrate remediation within 30 days or submit to county-supervised demolition, costs of which would be assessed against the property. He turned the notice over, blank on the back. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket alongside Drummond's still unopened envelope from 3 days ago, and went back inside. He had spent those 3 days differently than he had expected to spend them. He had driven to Salem and spent a day at the Oregon State Archives, where a records assistant named Tom had helped him locate the original TVI weather station filings from 1950 to 1967, the actual data, not summaries, submitted to the county assessor's office as the evidentiary basis for the agricultural reclassifications. He had photographed every page with his phone, working methodically through the folders while Maverick waited in the truck in the parking lot with the windows cracked and the radio on. He had also located the Oregon State Climatological Office records for the same period, which were public and available and had never been compared in any document Wade could find to TVI's filings. Edgar had been right. The data sets did not agree. In some years, the discrepancy was small, within the range of measurement error, perhaps defensible. Across 15 years, across the specific geography of the Tillamook Creek watershed, the pattern was not defensible. TVI's station had consistently underreported rainfall during the years immediately preceding each reclassification. Not dramatically. Dramatically would have been noticed, subtly, in the specific range that pushed land from marginal to agriculturally non-viable under the county's assessment criteria. It was, in the language Edgar's hydrologist had used in 1987, systematic and statistically non-random. In shorter language, manufactured. He was organizing his photographs into folders on his laptop, a 6-year-old machine that he kept charged off the truck's power adapter, when Drummond's pickup came down the gravel road on Thursday afternoon. This time there were 2 vehicles. The second was a gray sedan, rental clean, carrying a man in his 40s with a leather portfolio and the specific expression of someone accustomed to rooms where his presence changed the temperature. Drummond knocked once and opened the porch door without waiting, which was new. The first visit had been calibrated courtesy. This was something else. Mr. Calloway. He came in, looked at the table, the notebook, the photocopies, Wade's laptop with its grid of document photographs, and did not change his expression, which was itself a kind of tell. The man with the portfolio stayed in the doorway. You received the structural notice. I did. I want to reiterate that the county's offer remains available. He reached into his vest and produced the same style of envelope as the first one, thicker, placed it on the table beside the notebook without touching the notebook. $50,000, clean title, immediate transfer. The county assumes all structural liability and demolition costs. You walk away today with more money than this property will ever generate in any viable use scenario. He paused. I'm also in a position to tell you that the 30-day remediation window in that notice is not elastic. The county has an obligation to the public. Maverick was standing at the edge of the room. He had done something Wade had seen him do perhaps 4 times in 8 years. He had turned his back on the men at the door and was facing the far wall. Not the wall with the survey map, the plain wall. He stood there with his ears flat and his tail low and his weight shifted slightly forward, the posture of an animal that had assessed a room and made a determination so complete that continued monitoring was unnecessary. He already knew he was simply waiting for Wade to catch up. I appreciate the offer, Wade said. Then you'll consider it. I said I appreciate it. Drummond held the eye contact for 3 seconds, the specific duration of a man deciding whether a conversation had concluded or merely paused. And then he picked up the envelope from the table. He had set it down as a gesture of confidence. Taking it back was a different gesture. My number is the same, he said. He left without introducing the man with the portfolio, who followed him out and said nothing throughout. The gravel crunched, the engine started, and then it was just the creak again. Wade looked at Maverick. Maverick turned from the wall and looked at Wade with the level, unblinking attention that meant an assessment had been completed and filed, and the results were available. Yeah, Wade said. I know. He read the rest of Edgar's notebook that night. He had been rationing it without meaning to, reading in sections, putting it down, returning to it. The way you rationed something you knew was finite and didn't want to run out of. But Drummond's visit had changed the timeline's feel, and Wade read straight through from page 60 to the end, sitting on the floor with his back against the wood stove and Maverick's weight against his right leg. The later entries in the notebook were different from the earlier ones. The facts remained precise. Edgar never stopped being precise. But something had changed in the circumstance column as the years moved through the 1960s. The notations became slightly longer. Small details appeared that had not been there at the beginning. A daughter who had gone to Portland after the sale because there was no reason left to stay. A man who had worked the same 300 acres as his father, and his grandfather who had taken a job at a cannery in Astoria, and had not, in Edgar's notation, seemed like a man who had chosen to do that. A family whose children had grown up knowing their parents' land only as someone else's irrigation district. Edgar had known these people. That was what the later entries made clear. He had not been compiling a record from a distance. He had been sitting at kitchen tables, accepting coffee, listening, writing it down afterward in his careful hand. He had spent 15 years doing this. And then, the entry that stopped Wade entirely. Tidewater, Henry J. Addendum, June 1966. Henry told me today that he does not blame me for what happened. He said this directly, unprompted, while we were walking the creek bank below the bridge. He said, "You didn't take the land, Edgar. You just couldn't stop them." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. I have thought about it every day since. I believe he meant it as a kindness. I am not certain I deserve it. I am also not certain it's accurate. A man who watches a wrong being done and cannot stop it is not the same as the men doing it. But he is not nothing either. He is something. I have spent 9 years trying to determine what exactly that something is. I have not arrived at an answer. I have arrived instead at this. I can keep going. I can keep writing it down. I can make sure that when the right moment comes, and I believe it comes, I have to believe it comes, the record is there, and the record is accurate, and the record names every name. That is the thing I can do. So, that is the thing I will do. Wade read that paragraph 3 times. He thought about a man who had stood before a county commission in 1963 and been heard for 11 minutes. He thought about the newspaper reporter who came and took notes and published nothing. He thought about 15 years of kitchen tables and creek banks and a family reunion in 2003 where Edgar had sat at the far end of a picnic table and listened more than he spoke and left early without explaining why, carrying all of this, the whole weight of it, in the particular silence of someone who had learned that explaining was not the same as being heard. He made his choices, Uncle Roy had said. He had. Wade understood now what choices those were and what they had cost and why no one in the family had wanted to discuss them at a picnic. It was easier to call a man difficult than to sit with the specific discomfort of what he had actually been doing. Outside, the rain had started again, the steady, unhurried November rain of the Oregon coast that didn't announce itself, just arrived and settled in as if it had always been there. The creek's sound deepened slightly, picking up volume with the new water coming off the hillsides above. Wade closed the notebook. He picked up his phone and opened the email from Patricia Hess that had contained the property documents. There was one attachment he had not opened, the sealed letter Edgar had left him specifically. He had been saving it in the same irrational way he had been rationing the notebook. He opened it now. It was 4 sentences. Wade, I watched you at the reunion in 2003. You sat with your back to the wall and you watched the room and you didn't miss anything. That's all I needed to know. Edgar. Wade sat with that for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and started scanning. The name at the bottom of Edgar's updated contact list was Louise Tidewater. Not Henry. Henry would be in his 90s now, or gone, but the address was a rural route in Tillamook County, 10 miles north of the bridge, and the handwriting that had added the name to the list was not Edgar's. Someone else had maintained this document after Edgar could no longer maintain it himself. Someone had updated the contacts, crossed out the names of people who had died, added addresses when families moved, kept the list current and ready for exactly the moment that it was now being used. Wade drove there on a Friday morning with the notebook on the passenger seat and Maverick in the back, watching the road through the rear window with the steady attention of a dog that took vehicular travel seriously. The house was a small farmhouse set back from the road behind a stand of Sitka spruce, painted white, with a covered porch that held 2 Adirondack chairs and a cast-iron boot scraper, and a wind chime made from what appeared to be pieces of abalone shell. The chime was moving in the coastal wind, making a sound that was less sound than suggestion. The woman who answered the door was 78 years old and looked it in the way that some people looked their age, not diminished by it, but settled into it, the way an old tree was settled into its own shape. She had gray hair pulled straight back and dark eyes that assessed Wade in approximately 1 second and apparently reached a conclusion she was comfortable with, because she opened the door wider and said, "You're Edgar's boy." "Grandson," Wade said. "I know." She looked at Maverick, who was sitting at Wade's left side with his ears forward and his posture at its most composed. The bearing he adopted, Wade had noticed over 8 years, when he was in the presence of someone he had decided deserved it. "He told me you were Army. He said you had a dog." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." Her kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the particular domestic warmth of a house that had been lived in by the same person for a very long time. She poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the table and sat down with the directness of a woman who did not have patience for the kind of conversation that required 20 minutes of circling before arriving at the point. "You found the box?" she said. "My dog found it." Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, not amusement exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if a detail had fallen into place that she had been curious about. "Edgar said there was a right person and a right time," she said. "He was specific about the right person. He wasn't sure about the time." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He worried, at the end, that he had waited too long, that the people who needed to see the record would be gone before it was found. "Henry?" Wade said. "My father died in 2019. She said it without softening it, the way people who had carried grief long enough said things. Not hard, just finished. He was 87. He got to see the creek in all its seasons from this house for 60 more years after they took the land. So I won't say he had nothing." She paused. "But he should have had the land too. Both could have been true." Wade set the notebook on the table between them. She looked at it for a moment without touching it, the same posture the librarian had used with fragile documents, hands back, reading from a distance. Then she opened it to the first page and read the first entry and closed it again. "I know what's in it," she said quietly. "Edgar read it to me the last time I saw him. 2009. He was 87, and his hands shook, and he read every entry out loud, all of them, and I sat here at this table and listened." She looked at the window, at the spruce moving in the wind outside. "It took 4 hours. "You've been maintaining the contact list," Wade said, "since 2001 when his hands got bad enough that writing was difficult." She turned back to him. "I wasn't the only one. There were 3 of us. Women, all of us, which Edgar found both humbling and unsurprising. He said women were better at the long work." A brief pause. "He wasn't wrong. Why didn't you do something with it after he died?" She looked at him with the patience of someone who had answered versions of this question in her own mind many times over many years. "With what standing?" "A notebook kept by a man who was known in this county as an eccentric, photocopies of documents whose originals we couldn't produce. A hydrologist's analysis from 1987 with no institutional backing." She shook her head, not in defeat, but in the manner of someone describing terrain they had mapped thoroughly. "Edgar tried the commission. He tried the newspapers. He tried the state land board. Every time TVI's lawyers showed up with better paperwork and more time and more money, and the record went back in the box." She looked at Wade directly. What was needed was not more of the same thing. What was needed was someone with a different kind of standing at the moment when TVI was asking for something they needed badly enough to make noise. The water project, Wade thought. The watershed they needed the bridge's land to control. The company behind the county's infrastructure proposal. He had looked it up 2 nights ago, working through the county planning documents online until the ownership structure became clear. Tillamook Valley Irrigation had not been dissolved. It had been reorganized twice, folded into holding companies whose names had changed but whose principal assets, the water rights in the Tillamook Creek Basin, had not. The project Drummond was shepherding through the county commission was not a habitat restoration project. It was an expansion of the same water control infrastructure that TVI had been building since 1952, using land that had been cleared of its original owners through the mechanism Edgar had spent 15 years documenting. "They still need the watershed," Wade said. "They always needed the watershed," Louise said. "That's why they took it in the first place." The legal notice, the second one, not the 30-day structural hazard designation, but a new document, arrived Saturday morning by certified mail, was an emergency demolition order. 72 hours. The structural hazard presented an imminent public safety risk. County crews would arrive Monday morning. Wade read it on the porch. The rain had stopped overnight and the morning was clear and cold, the Coast Range visible to the east with its first dusting of early snow on the higher ridges. The creek below the bridge was running full and loud, carrying the week's rain seaward in the unhurried way of water that had been doing this since before the bridge existed, and would be doing it after. He went inside and called the number Louise had given him. Her name was Claire Morales, and she was a land rights attorney in Portland who had spent the last 12 years working on cases involving indigenous land claims in the Pacific Northwest. Louise had kept her number on the contact list for 6 years, updated it twice when the firm changed addresses, and described her in a single sentence. She answers on the first ring, and she does not need things explained twice. Both were accurate. Wade talked for 22 minutes. He described the notebook, the hydrological analysis, the property transfer records, the TVI ownership chain he had traced through the county planning documents. He described the timing, the water project, the escalating offers, the emergency demolition order that had arrived 48 hours after he declined $50,000. Claire Morales was quiet for a moment when he finished. "How complete is the documentation?" she asked. "Edgar was thorough," Wade said. "I've been cross-referencing with state archives for a week. Everything he wrote checks out against primary sources." "And you have the originals in hand?" "Notebook, hydrologist's analysis, photocopies of the purchase agreements, everything he sealed in the box." Another pause, a lawyer's pause, but a different kind than Patricia Hess's. This one was not selecting a version. This one was calculating. "The emergency demolition order has to go through the county court to be enforceable," she said. "That takes a judge's signature, which means a hearing, which means notice, which means time. They're hoping you don't know that." She paused again. "I can file for an injunction this afternoon that will freeze the demolition order pending review of the land acquisition history. It won't be permanent, but it will be long enough." He could hear her already moving, the sound of a chair, a keyboard. "Can you scan and send everything in the box today?" "Already scanned," Wade said. "I can send it in an hour." "Send it now," she said. "I'll call you when the injunction is filed." He sent everything, every photograph from the state archives, every page of Edgar's notebook, the hydrologist's analysis, the photograph of Edgar and Henry in front of the bridge, the letter. And then he went outside and stood on the bridge. The planks were solid underfoot. Old-growth Douglas fir, treated with care across 6 decades by a man who had understood that some structures needed to outlast the people who built them. Monday morning came with flat gray light and no county vehicles. Claire Morales called at 8:15. The injunction had been granted. The demolition order was stayed pending a federal review of the property acquisition records associated with the Tillamook Creek watershed, a review that had been formally requested by 3 tribal members whose family names appeared in Edgar's notebook and who had been contacted by Louise Tidewater's network over the weekend. Drummond did not come himself. A county attorney Wade had not met before drove out mid-morning, walked to the porch, looked at Wade and Maverick for a moment, and then got back in his car and drove away without speaking. Maverick watched the car go from the top porch step, sitting perfectly still, ears straight, until the sound of the engine faded entirely into the trees. Then he looked at the bridge, then at Wade. Then his tail moved, once a single slow arc, the specific gesture he reserved for moments when the situation had resolved itself into something he approved of. Wade sat down on the porch step beside him. The creek ran on below them, full and cold and unhurried, carrying whatever the hills had given it seaward, in the continuous way of water that kept no record of what passed over it, that simply moved, that simply carried, that had been doing exactly this since before anyone had thought to build a bridge above it or fight about the land on either side. Spring came late to the Coast Range that year. It came the way it always came to that particular elevation, not as a single arrival, but as a series of negotiations between the cold and the light, the Douglas fir holding their dark color through February and March, while the red alder along the creek margins began, tentatively, to bud. By April, the creek had settled from its winter volume to something smaller and cleaner, and the mornings had started arriving with actual light in them, rather than the provisional gray that passed for light in November. Wade had spent the winter working on the cottage. He had replaced the porch joists in December, a 2-day job that his knee made into a 4-day job, which he accepted without resentment, because resentment about the knee was a luxury he had discontinued some time ago. Around the same point, he had discontinued other luxuries, like the belief that things were supposed to go a particular way. He reglazed the windows in January. He rebuilt the chimney's upper course in February with stone he quarried from the creek bank, the same local basalt that whoever had built the original chimney had used, so that the new work matched the old work in the way that good repair always matched, not invisibly, but honestly, the repair visible as repair without apologizing for it. He could not afford a contractor. He did not need one. He knew how to do this work, and his hands remembered it even when his knee argued, and there was something in the doing of it, the specific satisfaction of a structure becoming sound again under your hands, that he had not felt in a long time and had not realized he had missed. The Federal Review moved slowly as federal things moved. Claire Morales had told him to expect this and not to interpret slowness as failure, and he had taken her at her word because she had been right about everything else. By March, the review had formally encompassed all property transfers in the Tillamook Creek watershed between 1950 and 1970. 231 transactions in total, which was one more than Edgar's notebook. A discrepancy that Claire noted meant Edgar had likely missed one and that his accuracy rate was otherwise 100%. TVI's successor company, the holding entity currently structured as Pacific Watershed Partners, LLC, which Wade had spent 3 evenings tracing through the state business registry, had retained a Portland law firm and issued a statement describing the review as politically motivated and the historical records as incomplete. The statement was 6 paragraphs long and said nothing specific, which Claire said was exactly what a statement said when there was nothing specific to say. Louise had told him the second time he visited that she didn't expect the land to come back. She had said it without bitterness, in the same finished way she had spoken about her father's death, as a fact that had been carried long enough to lose its jagged edges without losing its weight. The law has a hard time running backward, she said. Edgar understood that. What he wanted was the record. He wanted the names said out loud in a room where they had to be heard. That happened in April. Claire had arranged for the Federal Review Panel to hold a public session in Tillamook, a procedural requirement that Pacific Watershed Partners attorneys had attempted to waive and had not succeeded in waiving. The session was in the county courthouse, a wood-framed building that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee, and it was not large, and it was not televised, and the 3 panel members conducting it were bureaucrats rather than judges, with the specific careful neutrality of people whose job was to listen accurately rather than to feel. But the room was full. Louise sat in the second row with 2 women Wade had not met. The other 2 who had maintained the contact list he understood without being told. Behind them, families. Not all 231. Some were gone, dispersed, the thread between them and this particular room too long and too frayed to pull them back. But enough. Enough that when the panel chair read the first name from the registry, Tidewater, Henry J. and Ruth M., 340 acres, Section 12, Township 2 South, sold March 1954. There was a woman 2 rows behind Louise who put her hand over her mouth, not in surprise but in the specific gesture of someone who had waited a long time to hear a thing said correctly and was experiencing the arrival of that moment. Wade sat in the back row with Maverick at his left knee. He had not been asked to speak. He was not the story. He understood this clearly and was comfortable with it in the way he was comfortable with most things that were true, not because they were easy, but because they were accurate, and accuracy had been the only currency that mattered in this room since 1958, when Edgar Calloway had sat across a kitchen table from Henry Tidewater and begun writing things down. He listened to the names, all 231 of them, read by the panel chair in the flat, careful voice of a man doing his job, which was to make sure the record was entered and the record was complete. It took 40 minutes. The room did not get smaller during those 40 minutes. If anything, it got larger. The particular expansion of a space when the weight of what is being said in it is proportional to the walls. When it was done, Wade went outside. The April morning was clear and cold, the coastal cold that lingered past its welcome, but had started, in the last week, to lose its conviction. He stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the street and thought about a thin man at the far end of a picnic table, watching a room, leaving early without explaining why. You sat with your back to the wall and you watched the room and you didn't miss anything. That's all I needed to know. He had not understood at 21 that this was a compliment. He had not understood at 21 that the specific alertness he'd been born with, the alertness that had made him a good ranger and a poor sleeper and a man who could not sit with his back to a door, was also the thing that would make him the right person to open a box rather than sell it. You did not choose what you were made of. You chose eventually what you made of what you were made of. Edgar had understood this and had spent 60 years making something out of his particular materials. Precision, stubbornness, the willingness to keep going when the people you were going for could not see you doing it, and had left the last step to someone else because that was the nature of long work. It outlasted the people who began it. Maverick came to stand beside him on the steps. He had been very good in the courthouse, still, quiet, tucked under Wade's chair with his chin on his paws, not sleeping, but not intrusive, the composure of a trained animal in a formal setting. Outside now he shook himself once, the full-body shake of a dog releasing indoor stillness, and pressed his flank against Wade's leg for a moment before moving to the top step and sitting down to look at the street. Wade looked at him. 8 years. The gray on his muzzle had spread this winter, down his cheeks now, beginning at the corners of his eyes, and his pace on cold mornings had acquired a new deliberateness, a slight gathering of effort before steps that he had once taken without thinking. He was slowing. Wade had known this was coming in the theoretical way. You knew things that hadn't arrived yet, and now that it was arriving, he was finding that theoretical knowledge was not the same as the real kind, but that the real kind was something you lived with rather than solved, the same as most things that mattered. Maverick looked at the street with his ears forward and his posture easy, reading whatever the April morning was carrying through downtown Tillamook: exhaust, coffee, the salt and fur smell of the coast, information from a world he processed more completely than the humans around him, and reported on in the specific language of ears and posture and the angle of a shoulder, a language Wade had spent 8 years learning and would spend the rest of his life being glad he had. On a Saturday in early May, Louise brought people to the bridge, not a ceremony. She had been specific about this when she called. Not a ceremony, just people coming to a place that is part of their story. 7 of them arrived in 3 vehicles, ranging in age from a woman, perhaps 80, with a cane, to 2 children who immediately went to the creek bank and began the universal child assessment of how close they could get to the water without being told to step back. Wade had set out chairs on the bridge deck, 4 old camp chairs from his truck, and 3 he had borrowed from Louise. And there was coffee in a thermos and a box of things people had brought without being asked, the way people brought things when they came together in a place that meant something. He stayed at the edge of it. Not because he didn't belong. Louise had made clear he was welcome, and he believed her. But because there was a way in which the bridge was not his, had never been his, and being at the edge of what was happening on it felt accurate in the same way that accuracy always felt. Not comfortable exactly, but right. Maverick moved through the group without being directed. He was unhurried and thorough, accepting attention from the children and from the older woman with the cane, and from a man in his 50s who crouched down to his level and held his face in both hands for a moment and said something Wade couldn't hear from where he stood. Maverick stayed still for that, accepting it with the grave attentiveness he brought to moments that seemed to require it. Wade leaned on the downstream rail of the bridge and looked at the creek below. The water was April clear, low enough now to see the creek bed. The dark basalt stones, rounded by 10,000 years of this same water, moving over them, and the quick silver movement of a small trout holding in the current behind a mid-channel rock, finning against the push of the water to stay in exactly the place it had chosen. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the photograph. Edgar and Henry. The bridge behind them, paint still bright, the creek visible below, between the open sides. Two men who had understood something about what it cost to stand where you believed you should stand, and who had stood there anyway, and who had not been standing together in front of this bridge for the camera. They had been standing there for this. For the May morning 70 years later, and the sound of children at the water's edge, and the coffee going around, and the particular quality of a group of people gathered in a place that had waited for them, that had been kept for them by a man with careful handwriting and a long stubbornness, and the specific faith of someone who believed that the right moment came if you preserved the record long enough to meet it. Wade put the photograph back in his pocket. Maverick had come to stand beside him at the rail. He did not look at Wade. He put his chin on the top rail and looked at the water below, at the current, at the stones, at the small trout holding in its chosen place, with the complete, unhurried attention of an animal that lived in the present tense without effort, for whom the only moment that existed was this one, which was enough, which had always been enough. The water moved. The morning held. Below the bridge, the creek carried what the hills gave it, the way it always had, the way it would long after the bridge was gone and the people on it were gone, and whatever came after them had built their own structures over the same dark stones, telling their own stories about what the water remembered. It remembered everything. It said nothing. It kept moving.